Hello and welcome, Exiles, to my final build for the 10D challenge, which is a zombie spell-slinging minion instability build, where we sling the zombies and they explode. Now you'll see when I sling the zombies, there's two of them because I'm building around not a witch, I'm building around a saboteur for perfect crime. The idea was basically if I'm triggering these zombies in some way, I will get two every time they're triggered and thus double the damage was the idea. Because if they're two that summon, they both explode. And as far as I know, the less damage with trigger spells, that doesn't apply to the zombies' damage. That applies to me triggering the spells, and I'm not the one dealing the damage. The zombies are dealing damage. Kind of wacky, but I believe it's a way to get around the downside while having all the upside. Now, unfortunately for me, Slinger itself has other downsides outside of just being, what's the word? Slow to cast. Spellslinger has an innate cooldown of 0.6 seconds, which means when we actually have it up and running, the cooldown with my CDR from Saboteur is 0.46 seconds. And getting zombies out basically twice per second isn't really high high cast per second, and ultimately it probably doesn't end up making sense to do this as Spellslinger. Maybe you could try some other triggered setups. I wanted to go and try Spellslinger, and that's what I ended up doing. And on top of that, our fourth ascendancy point feels wasted. Like, CDR makes sense, Born in the Shadow makes sense, Perfect Crime makes sense, but Bomb Specialist or any of the other nodes don't really help us. It was either Bomb Specialist for slightly less damage taken from area hits, or Demolition Specialist, where we try to be a mine support for our zombies, where we throw like Stormblast mine down with high impact mine support to make enemies take increased damage, and then have a chance for our zombies to deal double damage against them. Maybe that would work out okay. I'm not really too sure because the uptime on that would be shaky, and it would limit how much damage uptime we had on actually spell slinging the zombies on top of an enemy. So that was the thought process behind the build. I'll go ahead and get into a map to showcase you what this looks like and talk about it. Is the map mods, this is a Phoenix. Long story short is this is one of the not good builds. This build we didn't do a single Uber with. It did not have the damage for, and quite frankly didn't really have the tankiness for. Our tree is stretched very awkwardly thin. I'm sure there's mistakes I'm making as somebody who isn't a, what's the word? I'm not an expert when it comes to minion instability builds. This is the first time I've ever made one, to be honest. So I'm sure I made mistakes there in of itself. But I think largely the biggest thing holding this build back was the fact I was doing Spellslinger, the slow cast time, on top of the fact I have to deal with a very high mana cost. It just gets kind of awkward. I'm not sure how you deal with the zombie mana cost because of how high it is, but there's probably some scenario where you could do that in a feasible way that makes sense. As for how I'm blowing up the zombies, normally people do Infernal Legion. What I am doing, there is an alt quality on zombies, which makes zombies take percentage of their life as chaos damage when you summon them, and I have it in a Dialas to give it 50% of their damage, or 50% of their life is taken as chaos when you summon them. And then if you combine that with Fortress Covenant, with a couple nodes with minions take increased damage, the zombies all of a sudden will die simply from the alt quality, allowing us to not have to spend a leak on Infernal Legion, which I think that's kind of cool. I think it's kind of neat. And it allows me to do a bunch of max fire res without bricking how long it takes them to die with building around Formless Inferno. All in all, I was trying out multiple things to see what would and wouldn't work. And the end result is I have a cook character that doesn't have great defenses because I'm spending so much reservation space on what's it called? On Spellslinger, and then I'm even using a Divine Blessing for Discipline just to have a bit better mana sustain, which isn't great, right? And that's really awkward. No! I wasn't supposed to die there. Anyways, you get the idea of what the character's issues are. Basically, I was struggling to get resistances, even any level of mitigation. I think ultimately, if you're playing a Saboteur, it makes so much sense to build into Grace with the blind node, and then build into like a Dread Banner for enemies having less accuracy, and then suppress, and then you end up feeling a lot tankier in that sort of situation, and actually building into things like the Pyromaniac for sustain, getting sustain in your build. But whereas when we're doing this Spell Slinger zombie thing, we don't actually have many ways to get mechanic. We can't sustain off leech. We can't sustain off gain on hit because we don't really attack that fast, and we have no accuracy. We have very limited options, and the options we ended up putting together are very scuffed, to say the least. This was an attempt, and this was a failure, but this wasn't my only failure in the 10 Div Challenge. I actually made 2 other builds that I will show you, just to give you an idea of what I tried to make, or what I was hoping would maybe work. And this other build we went with, I'll give you a brief you on, was an attempt at making a multiple Val skills, a multi-Val skill build with Yamok's Accord. My plan here was to have basically 2 Triumvirate Authorities, both with Soul Gain Prevention Duration and Regain Souls when used, and then have Regain Souls when used from a Adziri's Reign, I believe. Yes, Adziri's Reign. And the idea was, well, I'd have RF, I'd sustain with my flask, and then I would use these Soul Rippers to generate flasks, and when I would use one skill, it would generate the charges for the other skill. And the idea was I'd be able to essentially keep chaining between these to get multiple Val skill uses with Shepherds of Souls. Unfortunately, our tree was stretched way too thin, and we dealt very little damage. And on top of that, the Val Firestorm, this skill takes forever to hit the enemy. I think it takes like something close to 2 seconds before it actually hits the target. Like if I trigger it right now, 1,000, 2 1,000, 3 1,000, 4 1,000, it's like, yeah, like a 4-second delay, maybe 3-second delay if I was counting fast, of I press an area where I want this thing to hit, and it takes that long. Most Ubers move multiple times in that time frame, so getting damage to actually occur successfully with this skill is bad. And then I was also doing a Val Blade Vortex, but I don't have a lot of duration, so they only last a few seconds, and they can't really inflict that much damage. So maybe with some other skills it would make more sense. I know like Val Stormcall is a tried and true good ability that works great with duration shenanigans and stuff, and I didn't want to do it just because I knew that one worked, so I wanted to try some weird stuff like these other Val skills. So this is another character that didn't work, and how I don't know if I mentioned it, but Shepherd of Souls, the way it works is it gives 50% of its souls that you use to your other Val skills. So essentially what ends up happening is, say I'll use this skill right here, I don't have the souls here, but I use this skill, it'll generate souls for this thing. And then if I use this thing, it generates souls for that thing, right? And then if I use it again, generate more souls, I proc this, I get souls for this, I get souls for this. And that was the kind of the idea there. And I have a 40% chance to regain the souls of the skill I use, so it was kind of like trying to create a feedback loop for itself for generating souls. That was the idea. And then we had to reduce the soul gain prevention down really far, so that way we could keep using the skills, keep spamming them without getting the soul gain prevention to block the souls being shared. So that was the idea. Yeah, this character didn't work out great. And then last but not least of the characters I didn't show you that didn't work out great, I also tried to make a charge dash discharge character with the Crucible node that says trigger a skill every 1 second while doing discharge or blade flurry. There's this notable right here. Trigger socket spell while channeling blade flurry or charge dash. So the idea was I would channel this around, I would be going around the map or whatever I was doing and be proccing the discharge at the same time. The issue with this node, and this is the issue with a lot of these Crucible nodes, I noticed the same thing with Blight, the node that gives you AoE per second charge, is the second you stop charging and start charging again, it restarts the timer, and it waits a whole 1 second before it casts. Like, it's not like I can cast for 0.9 seconds and then 0.1 second and it will go boom. No. If you cast for 0.9 seconds, 0.9 seconds, 0.9 seconds, you will never actually trigger a discharge. You have to stand still for a full 1 second before it triggers discharge once. And so that is scuffed, and that's scuffed by itself. And then on top of that, discharge, I don't know, I'm not great at making discharge. Eventually I'll succeed. I keep wanting to make a discharge that's trigger based with like scuffed setups, and it hasn't worked out yet, but eventually it will. And this character was basically cast while channeling with ball lightning to generate power charges, those power charges would discharge. When I discharge, a Vol's Devotion would give me endurance charges, and I was kind of cycling between those two charge types. And that was the discharge character. And this character was also quite bad. So, all in all, there were 3 builds that just couldn't even do Uber Shaper, and it was a pathetic attempt at Uber Shaper to begin with. Maybe getting to the last phase a couple times with those builds, but all in all, still quite scuffed builds. I tried my best to make some pretty potato ideas work just to see what's possible. And a lot of times experimenting in PoE, this is what ends up happening, is you'll make builds that just aren't good. But if you're never experimenting, you're never really going to find a diamond in the rough. And for me, one of my best takeaways from this challenge, and my favorite build of the challenge I made, was my Toxic Rain Witch, or my Toxic Rain Necromancer. And all of my ideas were things that I didn't know if they'd work, I didn't know if they'd be good or not. Some of them worked, some of them didn't. And then, even though I had those 3 abject failures that were really bad, I also had this character, which I liked a lot, which is using Corpse Pact and Asneth's Chant as a way to scale an attack-based Necro, and I actually think this build turned out pretty good. So, for all 3 of those failures, I got one build that I for sure want to use. Maybe in the future I'd consider League starting as a Necromancer-based, attack-based character, and I think it could be pretty decent on League start. That was the idea I took away from it. And there's some other things that I might put into practice as well for future builds, but that is the, I guess, the takeaway for me on a lot of these 10D challenges. I want to experiment with new builds, new ideas, and see what I can do in terms of basically, is this something that could be really good? Can I take this tech and put it into another build? I like to try out different ideas, see what works, see what doesn't, and try to reapply those ideas to better and better builds to make a, I don't know, more solid package for different characters I create. That's the idea. Anyways, hopefully you guys enjoyed this series of the 10D builds, and for going forward, I have some other builds planned. We'll see how those go, and you'll see them on YouTube. Anyways, take care, Exiles, and peace out.